Welcome to the School of Wisdom, a weekly podcast produced for the Bible Bistro, studying the book of Proverbs chapter by chapter. My son, hear the instruction of your father. Forsake not the law of your mother, for they shall be an ornament of grace to your head, and chains about your neck. Now, this week's lesson. Hey there, welcome back to the School of Wisdom. Today we're going to be studying Proverbs chapter 3, so if you have your Bible, once you open it up to Proverbs chapter 3, you should also have a copy of the 10 Conditions of Proverbs. If you haven't already copied that out, those are found in Proverbs chapter 1, verses 2 through 7. If you don't have the ability to copy those out, you can go to my website, my-dailydose.com. And there on my-dailydose.com, you can go to the blog and look in the blog, and you'll see a blog entitled The 10 Conditions of Proverbs. Open that up, and then you should be able to copy and paste that. And you can paste it in a document of your own, or perhaps just print that out. So check that out. It's my-dailydose.com. All right, so today, chapter 3, we have 3 My Son lessons here in chapter 3. This one is filled with all kinds of good things. And probably here in Proverbs chapter 3, we have the best-known passage in the book of Proverbs. Probably everybody knows verses 5 and 6 in the book of Proverbs. So let's begin reading here in verse 1. My son, forget not my law, but let thine heart keep my commandments. For length of days and long life and peace shall they add to thee. The outlines that I use for the School of Wisdom, I'm going to post these so you can see them. But what we have here is the first lesson, verse 1, my son, forget not my law, but let thine heart keep my commandments, followed by a promise. And each one of these my son lessons is going to be followed by a promise. So we have the first one here in verse 1, we have the second in verse 11, and the third in verse 21. Nice symmetry between all of them. And then with each one, the next verse contains the promise that goes along with the lesson. And here the promise is, length of days and long life and peace shall they add. So what's the they in the promise? Well, the they in the promise is the commandments, the law, my commandments. Now, we have the commandments, the first part, listed there in 3 through 9. And if you're able to access mydailydose.com, you can pull up this outline and see how I've divided this out. So you have verse 3, verse 5, verse 7, and verse 9. These are the first 4 of the commandments that he's going to mention. And you'll notice that they all have to do with trusting the Lord. Let not mercy and truth forsake thee, there in verse 3. Bind them about thy neck, write them upon the table of thy heart. Verse 5, trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. Verse 7, be not wise in thine own eyes, fear the Lord, and depart from evil. Verse 9, honor the Lord with all thy substance, and with the firstfruits of thine increase. And then you'll notice verses 4, 6, 8, and 10 all have to do with either a promise or a result of each of these commandments. So as I said, this is the commandments part 1, because at the end of this chapter, we're going to have the second half of the commandments given that go along with this first lesson. Actually, the first lesson dominates the entire chapter. The other 2 lessons, 11 in verse 11 and then the other in verse 21, are subordinate in a way to what we have here in the first lesson in verse 1. Let's just look at these again. Let not mercy and truth forsake thee. Where does mercy and truth come from? It only comes from the Lord, right? And he tells us, he gives us this command, bind them about thy neck, write them upon the table of thine heart. So, we're to stick close to them and put them in our heart. We've already been told that we should hide his word. Now we're told how to hide. Bind them, write them. And then we have verse 4, which is the result or the promise. So shalt thou find favor and good understanding in the sight of God and man. This is what happens when you bind these things on your heart and write them on the table of your heart and bind them on your neck. Verse 5, Trust in the Lord with all thine heart. Here we have probably the most known, the most famous passage in Proverbs, the most often quoted passage in Proverbs. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart. Lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Now, verse 5 here contains one of the conditions of Proverbs, one of the 10 conditions, and that is understanding. That's number 2, to perceive the words of understanding. But you'll notice that this is not that kind of understanding. This is your own understanding. So this is not what Proverbs wants us to find. Proverbs says, depart from this. Don't lean on it. And then in verse 7, we have another one of the 10 conditions. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. So fearing the Lord is the 9th condition. But here, it's classed against being wise in your own eyes. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. And you notice verse 8, it shall be health to thy navel and marrow to thy bones, both a result and a promise of fearing the Lord and departing from evil. It's health for your navel, marrow to your bones. So there is some physical benefit here to fearing the Lord. It's a promise of the Scripture here. Honor the Lord with thy substance, and with the first fruits of all thine increase. So shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine. Do you notice like begets like in a sense? Fearing the Lord has an effect on the body. Honoring the Lord with your substance has an effect on the pocketbook. So I'm honoring the Lord with my substance, the first fruit of all my increase. And when I do that, when I'm faithful to do that, what happens? Barns are filled, presses burst out. So there's plenty and there's enough for everyone, but that happens because I honor the Lord with my substance. I don't know why we don't want to talk about money in regard to our Christian discipline. It is intricate to what we do as Christians. It's so much a part of who we are as believers. So we have these first 4 promises or commandments. They come with results and promises. Verse 3, let not mercy and truth forsake thee. Verse 5, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Verse 7, be not wise in your own eyes. Verse 9, honor the Lord with your substance. Be not wise in your own eyes, fear the Lord, and depart from evil. I should have continued that. So those are the first 4. We're told that these are the commandments. Keep my commandments. Then we have the second my son lesson, which begins here in verse 11. My son, despise not the chastening of the Lord, neither be weary of his correction. Okay? So here's the lesson. We're going to talk about correction. And it comes with a promise. Just like the promise we had in verse 2, followed verse 1. Now we have the lesson in verse 11, followed by a promise in verse 12. For whom the Lord loveth, he correcteth, even as a father the son in whom he delighteth. Now you say, well, Pastor, that's not much of a promise. The promise of correction? Yeah, but that's a good promise. Why is it a good promise? Well, look at verse 12. The Lord loves you. That's why he corrects you. Yeah, correction is a promise that comes from the Lord. And don't you want that? Of course you do. If you're his son, you want to please him. You want to glorify him. You want to honor him. That honor and glory that you give him, that's your first purpose, right? So the Lord loves me, therefore he corrects me. Even as a father and a son whom he delights. So here's a promise of that the Lord is going to love and delight in you. And that's going to lead to correction, but that's okay because this correction leads to something else. Verses 13 through 18 tell us what that something else is. But before we go on to verses 13 through 18, I just want to remind you that this comes over into the New Testament as well. Because in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 11, the Hebrew evangelist says, now no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. I have that in the note, by the way, there in the outline. I think maybe the Hebrew evangelist was reading Proverbs when he was writing chapter 12, or at least he was thinking about it, because the Lord loves those he corrects, as a father and the son whom he delights. And what does that do? What does correction always do for a child? It helps them see the foolishness of the way they were in and correct it. That's error. I'm going to correct you now, and the correction means I'm moving you over here into the path of life or righteousness. And if you're moved over into the path of righteousness because of the Lord's correction, verse 13, happy is the man that findeth wisdom. Yeah, because of correction, I can find wisdom. The man that getteth understanding. So this is not the kind of wisdom that we had up there in verse 7. Be not wise in your own eyes. This is the opposite. I think we're meant to see the comparison here, the contrast here. Be not wise in your own eyes, fear the Lord. That's going to lead to correction. Happy is the man that finds wisdom. This is the wisdom that we've already talked about. And the man that getteth understanding. This is the understanding that we've already talked about. This is the number 2 in the 10 conditions. Perceiving the words of understanding. This is that kind of understanding. This is not leaning on my own understanding. So you see the contrast here. And then we have, beginning in 14, going all the way down to 18, we have this comparison with wisdom. And in my notes I have, she is better than, she has, and she is. Because remember, wisdom is a woman. We've already seen her standing at the head of the corner, calling out, "You simple, how long we love simplicity." That lady who called out. Well, here she is again in chapter 3. For the merchandise of it is better than the merchandise of silver, the gain of it, therefore, than fine gold. She is more precious than rubies, and all the things thou canst desire are not to be compared to her. So wisdom and understanding, this lady that we're talking about now, she's better than silver, fine gold, rubies, and you name it. Anything that you can desire, it's not to be compared to her. So happy is the man that finds her. Notice what she has, verse 16. Length of days is in her right hand, in her left hand riches and honor. Her ways are the ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. So, not only is she better than silver, fine gold, rubies, and anything else that you can mention or desire, but she has length of days in the right hand, riches and honor in her left hand, pleasantness and peace. So if she has all these things, she's better than these things, she has these things. Wow, this is happy. Certainly happy is the man that finds wisdom. And then verse 18, she is a tree of life to them that lay hold upon her, and happy is everyone that retaineth her. So she is better than silver, fine gold, rubies, and all things that you can desire. They're not to be compared to her. She has length of days, riches, honor, pleasantness, and peace, and she is a tree of life to them that lay hold on her. And then you'll notice that we end with happy again. Happy is everyone that retaineth her. We began at 13 with happy is the man that findeth wisdom. Happy is everyone that retains wisdom. So if I find it and I retain it, then there's going to be happiness, and there's no longer going to be correction, because if I'm walking in these ways, if I'm walking in wisdom and understanding, that is the Lord's wisdom and the Lord's understanding, then I'm going to have all these. This is going to be for me, and I'm going to be happy. Okay? Happy is everyone that retains her. Now, we take a break in verses 19 and 20 because we're going to talk about the significance of wisdom and understanding. And you'll notice that we have in 19 and 20 what the Lord does with wisdom. Notice, the Lord by wisdom hath founded the earth. By understanding hath he established the heavens. By his knowledge the depths are broken up, and the clouds drop down dew. So how significant is wisdom and understanding? Didn't we just talk about that? Happy is the man that findeth wisdom, and the man that getteth understanding there in verse 13. This is how significant it is. The Lord, by wisdom and understanding and by his knowledge, he did all the things that he's done in creation, and he establishes and maintains everything in creation according to wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And you'll notice I tried to emphasize as I read that preposition by. The Lord by wisdom, by understanding, by his knowledge. We need to highlight that because it's by these things that the Lord did his work in creation and his work in maintaining creation still. So when the writer says, happy is the man that finds wisdom and gets understanding, well, this is not just any old thing. This happens to be the thing that the Lord used. So it's very significant. It's very significant. He kind of plops that right down here in the middle. Let's just take a break for a moment. And now we're getting ready to move on to the third lesson. Now we get it. Now we understand. That's how important this is. Then we have our third lesson. My son, let them not depart from thine eyes. Keep sound wisdom and discretion. The them there in verse 21 is wisdom, understanding, knowledge. That's what we've been talking about this whole time. And then we have at the end, keep sound wisdom and discretion. Oh, here's number 5 in our list of 10 conditions. And we find that there in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 4. For the young man, knowledge and discretion. So keeping sound wisdom and discretion. And again, we have in verse 22 a promise. So shall they be life unto thy soul and grace to thy neck. Again, the promise is, just like the promise that we had there in verse 2, length of days, long life, and peace shall they add to thee. Now we have a promise in verse 22, they shall be life unto thy soul and grace unto thy neck. We would expect that now, right? Because we know that wisdom, she is a tree of life. So life, yes, unto thy soul. We too often are thinking about the flesh and how to improve the flesh. Our generation is just so drunk with youthfulness. We want to stay youthful all of our life. We want the body to look its best. We want it to be its healthiest. We want to have that six-pack ab or whatever, the exercise gurus are trying to tell us that we have to have so that we can look our best in our bikinis or in our shorts or whatever. But what about the soul? What about the life of the soul? What are you doing to maintain your soul life? What are you doing to improve your soul life? Well, here it tells us that if we keep sound wisdom and discretion, we're going to have life for our soul. Because sound wisdom and discretion, they will be life under our soul. What are you doing to maintain your soul life and to improve it? Well, here then in verse 23 through 25, we have the effect of wisdom and discretion. Then shalt thou walk in thy way safely, and thy foot shall not stumble. When thou liest down, thou shalt not be afraid. Yea, when thou shalt lie down, and thy sleep shall be sweet. Be not afraid of sudden fear, neither of the desolation of the wicked when it cometh. So we have in verses 23 through 25 this effect of wisdom and discretion. Safety, no fear, sweet sleep. Why sweet sleep? Why does that pop in here? Because when we're worried and anxious, what do? It often troubles our sleep. Well, not now. Sleep's going to be sweet because the Lord's taking care of this, right? I'm walking in safety. I'm not stumbling. I'm not afraid. And notice the not afraid part is repeated after you'll lie down and your sleep will be sweet. Verse 25 says, be not afraid of sudden fear, neither of the desolation of the wicked when it cometh. And you'll notice that it's not if it comes, it's when it comes. So it's coming. There's no question about that. But when's it going to come? Well, I don't know that, but I know that it will. And when it does, I'm not going to be afraid of sudden fear, when things suddenly go bad. No, because why? Wisdom and discretion. They're keeping me. I'm keeping them, and therefore they're having an effect upon me. For the Lord shall be thy confidence, and shall keep thy foot from being taken. Well, there it is. That sums up 23 through 25, doesn't it? Verse 26 is sort of the summation of all that we just said about the effect of wisdom and discretion. The summation is, Lord, your confidence. That's why you're safe. That's why you're not afraid. That's why you can lay down at night, put your head on the pillow, and it's okay. He'll keep your foot from being taken. And then we have the second half of the commandments. We have more commandments here. This is part 2. You'll notice verse 27, 29, 30, and 31 all tell us these 4 commandments. Withhold not good from them to whom it is due, when it is in the power of thine hand to do it. Say not to thy neighbor, go and come again, and tomorrow I will give, when thou hast it by thee. Devise not evil against thy neighbor, seeing he dwelleth securely by thee. Strive not with a man without cause, if he have done thee no harm. Envy thou not the oppressor, and choose none of his ways. Now, I said in the first part, when we were talking about the first set of commandments, there in 3 through 9, this is all about trusting the Lord, fearing the Lord, honoring the Lord. So all of that is about the Lord and our relationship with Him. So the first part of the commandments that He gives us in this chapter. And then the second piece of the commandments that He gives us in this chapter are about our neighbor. Notice verse 27, say not to your, or 28, say not to your neighbor, go and come again. Has to do with withholding not good. Verse 29, devise not evil against thy neighbor. So now it's my neighbor that I'm talking to or about. This is the commandment. Strive not with a man. Who's the man? My neighbor. Envy not the oppressor. Who's the oppressor? My neighbor. Choose none of his ways. So the first 4 commandments that we had there in, 3 through 9, those commandments are the first part of the law. Here we have the second part of the law dealing with the neighbor. So our relationship with God, to worship Him only, to serve Him, and our duty that requires. And then the second half of the law is our relationship with our neighbor and our duty that requires. Here we have it. So that puts into perspective that first statement there in verse 1, my son, forget not my law, but let thine heart keep my commandments. Now we know he's not just talking about the Word of God in general. No, he's talking specifically, I think, about those 10 commandments. So we see that the 10 commandments now enter into the realm of wisdom. Of course, we already knew that instinctively, I think. And then in 32 through 35, we have the final comparisons. For the froward is an abomination to the Lord, but his secret is with the righteous. You see how he's dividing this up. He did this at the end of chapter 2 as well, but he only did it with single comparisons. Here we have 4 comparisons. The froward, the righteous, in verse 32. Verse 33, the curse of the Lord is in the house of the wicked, but he blesses the habitation of the just. So the wicked, the just. Verse 34, surely he scorneth the scorners, but he giveth grace to the lowly. The scorner, the lowly. And then 35, the wise shall inherit glory, but shame shall be the promotion of fools. So the wise and the fool. Now you notice the fool pops back up in here again. So we have the froward, the wicked, the scorner, and the fool mentioned here in the final comparisons in chapter 3. I hope you'll join me again next week as we look at Proverbs chapter 4 in the School of Wisdom. Hey, thanks for listening to the School of Wisdom podcast. If you're listening to this over YouTube, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so that you'll be notified every time one of these podcasts is uploaded. I really appreciate all my followers, and I try to respond to each and every one of your questions. Come again next week, and we'll enjoy another lesson in the School of Wisdom.